This is Joe Messi.
Hello, everyone. As you said, I'm Jean Messi. Those of you who already know me, what are you doing here? You should know better. For those of you who don't, so I'm a YouTuber, a history educator, science educator, author, playwright, all sorts of things. And tonight we're going to be talking about one of my very favorite subjects, nuclear weapons. Uh, well, actually, before we get started, I do want to address a malicious rumor that's been going around that I'm stockpiling Russian plutonium in my basement. No comment. So we don't tend to associate Canada with weapons of mass destruction. After all, we're signatories to all sorts of treaties and watchdog organizations to prevent their proliferation. However, during the Second World War, we did mass produce anthrax as a biological weapon on Grosse Île in the St. Lawrence. We also tested chemical weapons, including mustard gas, on our own troops, by the way, at Suffield in Alberta. And for 20 years during the Cold War, we were a nuclear armed power of sorts, deploying no fewer than 4 different nuclear weapon systems as part of our commitment to NATO and NORAD. Now, I say of a sort because we didn't produce these weapons ourselves, nor did we technically own them. Under what was known as a key sharing agreement, custody of these weapons remained at all times with the United States. They would only be transferred to Canadian custody for use in combat if war were declared. So as soon as these weapons appeared on Canadian soil, they were immediately controversial. And for this reason, and many others that we'll look at, they were out of service within 20 years. So tonight we're going to be looking at what weapon system Canada actually acquired, where and how we actually deployed them, and when and why we got rid of them. So let's get started. So Canada actually has a very long history in the field of nuclear physics. Some of the first major discoveries in the field were made at places like McGill University by the likes of this is Sir Ernest Rutherford. This is Harriet Brooks. She was the first Canadian woman to get a master's in physics. She made a lot of important discoveries in the field in the 1900s, 1910s. We also contributed heavily to the Manhattan Project. As we were hearing before, we supplied nearly 1,000 tons of uranium ore to the Manhattan Project. We also supplied a number of physicists, and one of the most famous was actually a Winnipegger. His name was Dr. Louis Slotin. So Slotin was in charge of arming the Trinity gadget, the world's first atomic bomb, detonated on July 16th, 1945. That's him right there. That's the bomb. But he's probably most famous for the horrific nature of his death. So after the war, he was involved in an experiment that was known as tickling the dragon's tail, which involved sandwiching a plutonium core in between 2 hemispheres of beryllium. And the idea was to figure out the critical mass, the minimum mass you needed of plutonium to create an atomic bomb. The closer the hemispheres got, the more neutrons were reflected into the core, and with a neutron counter, you could figure out when you reached criticality. There was a safe way of doing this, which involved removing shims between the 2 hemispheres, but Slotin thought, nah, and he decided to go for a much more dangerous method using a flathead screwdriver to vary the gap between the 2 hemispheres. His coworkers informed him that if he continued to do this, he would be dead within a year, and they were absolutely right, because on May 21st, 1946, the screwdriver slipped, the 2 hemispheres slammed together, and a bright blue light filled the room as the core went critical. Slotin managed to pull the hemispheres apart. He saved everybody else in the room, but he received a multiple times over lethal dose of radiation, and he died in agony a week later. And he's actually buried in his hometown here in Winnipeg. This is a photo that I took at Shari Zadok Cemetery up on Main Street, and that's his grave right there. And apparently he was buried in a lead-lined coffin, although given the exposure that he received, he wouldn't actually have been radioactive. They didn't know that at the time. So better safe than sorry. So on September 5th, 1945, Canada made nuclear history again when the zero energy experimental pile, or ZEEP, went critical for the first time at Chalk River Laboratories in Ontario. This was actually the second reactor the first reactor outside of the United States to go critical, even ahead of the Soviet Union, and only the second heavy water moderated reactor to operate anywhere in the world. And the technology pioneered by ZEEP and other reactors at Chalk River would inform the design of the famous CANDU reactor. So Canadian physicists ended the Second World War with the knowledge of how to build an atomic bomb, but Canada as a country chose not to pursue that avenue. Number of reasons for this, mainly political, but also practical. Making an atomic bomb is expensive. You need to build gigantic facilities just to make the plutonium and the uranium you need to fuel the bombs. And Canada simply didn't have that industrial capacity. We barely had industrial capacity to build nuclear reactors, which is why the CANDU reactor was designed the way it was, but that's a whole other boiling kettle of fish. However, this did not stop us from hosting American nuclear weapons on our soil. So starting in early 1950, Strategic Air Command, or SAC, started stationing Mark IV 21 kiloton nuclear bombs at Goose Bay in Labrador. This is very similar to the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945, only it's built for mass production, and it also has something called in-flight core insertion, where the core was carried separately in the aircraft in something called birdcage. Then you would open up these doors at the front and put the core in just before dropping the bomb. It made the whole system a whole lot safer. Now, at the time, SAC's main aircraft was the Boeing B-50 Superfortress. This was an upgraded version of the B-29 from the Second World War. These had very short range, relatively speaking, and so they had to land in Goose Bay to refuel and service their weapons before carrying on to attacking targets in the USSR. Now, at the same time, other aircraft, including the gigantic Convair B-36 Peacemaker, were regularly flying over Canadian territory, both on exercises as well as flying to and from bases in places like Alaska. Now, with all these nuclear-armed aircraft flying around, accidents are bound to happen, and indeed 2 of them did in the year 1950. So on February 15, 1950, a B-36 was flying from Elson Air Force Base in Alaska to Carswell Air Force Base in Texas, when it encountered engine icing over British Columbia. They decided to jettison their Mark IV bomb. Thankfully, it wasn't armed with its plutonium core, so the conventional explosives aboard just detonated harmlessly over the inside passage. The crew then bailed out, and the aircraft continued unmanned for quite some distance, you can see the path here, until it rammed into the side of Mount Kologet, where a lot of the pieces still remain to this day. Unfortunately, 4 of the crew died of exposure before they could be rescued. Later that year, SAC started withdrawing its B-50s as well as its Mark IV bombs from Goose Bay. And on November 10th of that year, a B-50 was flying out of Goose Bay when it also encountered engine trouble, this time near Rivière-du-Loup in Quebec. Again, they dropped their bomb, wasn't armed. It detonated harmlessly over the St. Lawrence. Although thankfully they didn't have to bail out, they managed to make a safe emergency landing at Loring Air Force Base in Maine. Now, that would have been the last time that Goose Bay hosted nuclear weapons. However, it did host tanker aircraft for Operation Chrome Dome, which was the SAC airborne alert mission where they would fly circuits near the North Pole and near southern Europe so that if missile silos and air bases in the States were wiped out by a preemptive strike, they would have second strike capability. Those aircraft could dash over the border and strike targets in the USSR. Also, in 1967, we signed the Argentia Agreement, which allowed the U.S. Navy to station nuclear anti-submarine weapons in Argentia, Newfoundland. And then from 1957 to 1966, a squadron of Convair F-102 Delta Daggers armed with Falcon, like AIM-26 Falcon nuclear-tipped missiles. They were stationed at Stephenville in Newfoundland. If you're wondering what all of these American forces are doing in Newfoundland, those were leftovers from the Destroyers for Bases deal at the beginning of the Second World War, where the U.S. Navy traded obsolete destroyers to the British in exchange for naval bases in the Western Hemisphere. Now, Canada did not have its own nuclear weapons, but of course we contributed to Cold War defense in a number of other ways. For example, the Pine Tree Mid-Canada and Distant Early Warning, or DEW radar lines, which became operational at the end of the 1950s. We also operated 14 squadrons of Avro Canada CF-100 Canuck interceptors to defend our airspace, and 12 squadrons of CF-86 Sabres in Western Europe as part of our commitment to NATO. But there was a bit of a problem here. Well, number one, these radar lines became semi-obsolete with the advent of intercontinental ballistic missiles. The risk of Soviet bombers coming over the pole was significantly reduced. Also, these aircraft were armed with what can only be termed World War II armament. The F-86, of course, had 6 50 caliber machine guns. CF-100 had 8 50 caliber machine guns and a belly pack, and also wingtip rocket pods containing a total of 58 folding fin aerial rockets, FFARs, also known as the Mighty Mouse. And these were woefully inadequate against high-altitude Soviet strategic bombers like the Tupolev 95 Bear. And a good illustration of just how useless these weapons were is something called the Battle of Palmdale, which occurred on August 16, 1956. So this was in California, and what happened was a U.S. Navy drone, basically a modified Grumman Hellcat, went rogue, and 2 F-89 Scorpion interceptors were sent to shoot it down. Despite chasing it for hours and shooting a grand total of 208 rockets at it, they failed to shoot it down. And so, and some of these rockets actually fell into the backyards of civilians, caused a bunch of fires and damage and things like that. It was a shit show. And this is a problem, because if a single nuclear bomber gets through your defenses, that's millions of civilians probably dead. This is the bitter calculus of nuclear warfare. Now, of course, the solution to this was supposed to be the Avro Canada CF-105 Arrow, which was armed with the Hughes Sparrow 2 radar-guided air-to-air missile. Unfortunately, that was canceled on February 20th, 1959, by this guy. Boo, hiss. Come on, boo, boo, John Diefenbaker. Yeah, we hate this guy. So he canceled the Arrow ostensibly on the grounds of cost, but instead of buying a manned interceptor to replace it, he went for a guided missile, the Boeing CIM-10 BOMARC. Here's the problem, though. The BOMARC was not accurate enough to ensure a kill with a conventional high-explosive warhead. It had to be fitted with a nuclear warhead. But Diefenbaker was very hesitant to do this. He knew it would be very unpopular with the Canadian people, and so he waffled on this acquisition for many years. This pissed off the Americans, especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it also pissed off the rest of the Canadian government, including the Liberals under Lester B. Pearson. And this actually caused a political crisis that led to Diefenbaker losing the 1963 election to Pearson's Liberals. So as soon as Pearson came into power, he set up a cabinet defense committee headed by Minister of National Defense Paul Hellyer to examine the problem of Canada acquiring nuclear weapons as part of its commitments to NATO and NORAD. Now, again, just like Diefenbaker, he was very hesitant to do this. He knew that it would be very unpopular, but he campaigned on the promise of acquiring these nuclear weapons, and he knew that we had these commitments. So he decided to go through despite his reservations. If only our politicians today had that much integrity. But still, Pearson was very careful about how he went about this. So, for example, he questioned the Cabinet Defense Committee endlessly. For example, as do we really, really need nuclear weapons for the BOMARC? And Hellyer said yes. As you can see from this quote here, he said the only thing more useless than a BOMARC is a BOMARC without nuclear weapons, because they'd be absolutely, worthless. You can't shoot anything down with that. Pearson was also concerned that any systems that Canada acquired would become obsolete by the time they went into service. But he was assured by President John F. Kennedy and his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, that the BOMARC would remain in service until at least 1966, and the NATO nuclear strike mission in Western Europe would remain on the books until at least 1969. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And finally, Pearson was concerned that Canada not technically own these nuclear weapons. Instead, he came up with the key sharing agreement where on Canadian bases, the warheads would actually be maintained and kept in the custody of American personnel and just handed over if war were declared. In his words, if necessary, nuclear weapons for Canada, but not necessarily Canadian nuclear weapons. So based on this, Hellyer drew up a proposal that Canada should acquire 5 nuclear weapons systems. The first was, of course, the BOMARC. There's also the Douglas AR-2 Genie air-to-air nuclear rocket, the MGR-1 Honest John surface-to-surface rocket for Royal Canadian Artillery Unit stationed in Western Europe. There was the various gravity hydrogen bombs to equip the RCAF CF-104 Starfighters, also based in Western Europe. And then finally, the Mark 101 Lulu nuclear depth charge for anti-submarine warfare in the Atlantic and the Pacific. That last one was immediately dropped because Pearson didn't want to continue to antagonize the anti-nuclear elements in the government, and also Canada had no standing commitment to anti-submarine warfare of this kind at that point, so he didn't want to overcommit himself. So that was slashed, and we went down to just 4 weapon systems. And just to give you an idea of how skittish the government was about this whole affair, the original report was titled Acquisition of Nuclear Warheads and/or Weapons for the Canadian Forces. That was then changed to Proposed Exchange of Notes Concerning Nuclear Warheads for the Canadian Forces. Gotta love politics. Anyway, the finalized proposal was finished by the summer of 1963, but the signing of it was delayed by the signing of the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which banned the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. It was thought politically imprudent to sign those 2 agreements so close to one another. So the actual agreement wasn't signed until August 16th of 1963. Its implementation was delayed further by the assassination of John F. Kennedy, but finally on December 20th, 1963, President Johnson signed the agreement, and then on the very last day of that year, the first nuclear warheads arrived on Canadian soil. So with all that background out of the way, let's have a look at what Canada actually got for its money. And by the way, the actual estimated cost for all of this was supposed to be $76 million up front and $8 million a year in upkeep. That's 10 times more today, approximately. So you're looking at $1 billion up front. So the first weapon was, of course, the CIM-10 BOMARC. This is built by Boeing. This is actually an acronym. CIM stands for Coffin-Launched Interceptor Missile. BOMARC stands for Boeing and the Michigan Aerospace Research Center, which helped design the missile. So now you know. So as the name implies, this was stored in and launched from a horizontal unhardened shelter nicknamed a coffin. Right before launch, the doors would open up on the top. A hydraulic arm would lift the missile up to its upright firing position. This is powered by a pair of Marquardt ramjet engines. Ramjets require a minimum airspeed to operate, so this was boosted off of its pad using a solid rocket booster. This would boost it to a maximum speed of Mach 2.8, a maximum altitude of 21 kilometers, and a maximum range of 600 kilometers. Initial guidance towards its target was by ground-based radar, whereupon an onboard seeker warhead would take over and complete the final interception, and then a proximity fuse would set off the W-40 warhead, which had a yield of 10 kilotons and a lethal blast radius of 1 kilometer. So this was intended to blow several bombers out of the sky at once if they weren't spaced far enough apart. Also, it had a much larger lethal radiation radius in the form of neutrons and gamma rays. And the idea here was that even if you didn't manage to blow a bomber out of the air physically, the blast of radiation would either kill the crew within a couple of hours, or it would damage the core and the firing electronics aboard the bombs that they were carrying. So even if they managed to get through and drop their weapons, they wouldn't work. So in total, there were 11 BOMARC stations built throughout North America, 2 of them in Canada, which we'll look at in just a second. These were all networked together along with interceptor air bases and various radars into a system called SAGE, Semi-Automatic Ground Environment. And these were controlled by absolutely enormous computers called the ANFSQ7, built by IBM. These are the largest discrete element computers ever built, meaning they didn't use any integrated circuits. It was all individual vacuum tubes, transistors, etc. So these were in these giant blockhouses, 3 stories. Basement in the first 2 stories were the computer itself, and then the operators were on the top floor. And just to give you an idea of how big these were, each one of these weighed 250 tons, had 60,000 vacuum tubes, 600,000 resistors, 5,000 kilometers of cabling. Guess how much memory? 250 kilobytes. 250 kilobytes for all that. How things have progressed. All right. So like I said, the operators were on the top floor, and they had these really cool consoles. You can see one of these at the Science and Tech Museum in Ottawa. And they showed up in science fiction films and TV series for many years after they were decommissioned. Actually had a little light gun that you could point at the screen. You pull the trigger, it would project a little beam of light, and you could choose from different menu items. And also right here, a built-in ashtray, because the 50s. So there were 22 SAGE blockhouses built across North America. There was one in Canada, which was at North Bay in Ontario, which at that time was the NORAD headquarters for Canada. Now it is here. And because these were such gigantic, obvious targets, there was also a backup system called BUIC, Backup Interceptor Control, which is a very creative name. There were 35 of those. There were 2 of them in Canada, at Senneterre in Quebec and at St. Margaret's in New Brunswick. And these were old Pine Tree radar sites that were converted over. And this map really shows why we wanted to acquire the BOMARC so badly, aside from saving money on a replacement for the Arrow. With a range of only 600 kilometers, a BOMARC launched from the United States would likely detonate somewhere over a populated area of Canada. So we wanted to move at least a few of these batteries a little farther north so that we could have these interceptions occur somewhere a little bit safer. So we built 2 BOMARC stations. This one is at North Bay. This one is at La Macasa in Quebec. These are actually current Google Earth images, and you can actually see the shelters are still there. 28 per squadron. So this was 446 and 447 surface-to-air missile, or SAM squadron. So the first nuclear warheads, which were the W-40s for the BOMARCs, arrived on Canadian soil on December 31st, 1963, New Year's Eve. The reason for doing this at this time was to avoid protesters. Thought everybody would be home celebrating. A few protesters did arrive and they tried to block the gate, but otherwise the delivery was uneventful. The delivery itself was conducted by the 19th Logistics Support Squadron, based out of Kelly Air Force Base in Texas. Now, what's really funny is that Customs insisted that all of the packages for these nuclear warheads had to be properly marked and signed for. And to disguise what they were, on the crates, they wrote in big letters, hazardous material, cocoa, like chocolate. I'm sure that fooled a whole bunch of people. So like I said, there were four deliveries of 7 nuclear warheads each. It went fairly uneventfully, except on January 8th, there was a freak earthquake in the area, and people really panicked because they thought that one of the warheads had gone off. Despite being deemed only marginally satisfactory, La Macasa started receiving its warheads on January 11th, and both squadrons became fully operational and armed in April and March of that same year. Now, there's a persistent rumor that Canada actually received its nuclear warheads a lot earlier as a precaution during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the evidence doesn't really bear this out. All of these nuclear armed stations, including the Voodoo airfields that we're going to look at a little bit later, they had to pass what was called an initial capability inspection, an ICI, before they could actually host nuclear weapons. 446 Squadron passed its ICI in February 1962, but because they had to have actual nuclear warheads on site to maintain their certification, they lost it and they didn't regain it again until November 1963, a full year after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Also, the squadrons didn't start receiving their BOMARC airframes until October 19th, 1962, at the tail end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So if they had their warheads, in the words of John Clearwater, they would have had to throw them at the Soviet bombers with their bare hands. But even if they had operational missiles, it's unclear whether they would have actually been of any use, because as we'll see a little bit later, there wasn't actually a plan in place for the US to authorize the deployment of Canadian BOMARCs until 2 years after the squadrons went active. So it probably would have gotten tangled up in bureaucratic red tape. And by the way, the launches of Canadian BOMARCs had to be authorized from the NORAD headquarters in North Bay and by the deputy commander of NORAD, who was always at that time a Canadian officer. Yeah, still is. Yeah. At that point, it would have been Roy Slemon, who actually saved the world in 1960 when they switched on the BMUs, the ballistic missile early warning system, and it went haywire. It said the Russians were sending all sorts of missiles at us. He looked at it and said, "That's nonsense. They've only got like 5." So he called off the alert, and it turns out it was the moon. The radar was bouncing off the moon, and the computer was interpreting it as this swarm of missiles. It's an insane, absolutely insane. And by the way, once they did get a procedure in place, I don't know if you can read it from here. This is the procedure to authorize the launch of the BOMARCs. Good luck doing that in an emergency. All right, moving on. I'm going to tread very carefully here because I know we have experts on this subject in the room. So correct me if I say anything wrong. So, of course, the next nuclear weapons that Canada acquired were various thermonuclear gravity bombs to equip the CF-104 squadrons in Western Europe, specifically in Germany. So Canadair acquired the license to build their copy of the Lockheed F-104 Starfighter in 1959. The aircraft entered service in 1962. Made a couple of modifications to it. They equipped it with an Orenda copy of the J-79 engine. They removed the Vulcan cannon, replaced it with some extra fuel capacity. They put in a radar and fire control system more suited to the low-level attack role, and put in more robust landing gear for rough field operations. Now, they were deployed as part of OneCAD over in Germany, and their mission was to halt a potential Soviet invasion of Western Europe, as through the Fulda Gap, by taking out key infrastructure such as bridges, radar sites, command bunkers, or even large concentrations of troops and vehicles. And to do this, we acquired 3 different nuclear weapons, not all at the same time. One replaced the other in succession. So the first was the B-28. This was a highly modular thermonuclear weapon carried by all sorts of aircraft, most famously the B-52. That's the bomb that they lost in the Mediterranean in 1968. 66, sorry. 68 was Tulane. And by swapping out various components, you could vary its yield from 11 kilotons all the way to 1.45 megatons. You could also, and Canada is thought to have fielded the 70 and the 350 kiloton variants. Also, you could swap out the exterior components. Canada used two different versions. One was the EX, or external variant. This had conventional tail fins and nose cone. It was fused for either air burst or ground contact burst. You could only use this in what was known as an over-the-shoulder or CAHS bomb delivery, also known as where you pull up the aircraft and then release the bomb so it would go into a lofted trajectory, and this would give you enough time to get out of the way before you were vaporized by your own bomb. You wouldn't, if you dropped it at level, it would just blow up beneath you and you were gone. But we also had the RE, the retarded external, yes, that's what it was called, which had a ribbon parachute, and that was for low-level delivery. In 1965, we replaced that with the B-43, which had a yield variable between 70 kilotons and 1 megaton. And then finally, in 1966, with the B-57. And it's thought, again, a lot of this is still classified, I believe. We're believed to have deployed between 210 and 450 bombs of all types during our commitment to the NATO mission. So, of course, these were deployed as part of one CAD, based in Lahr in Germany. So we have one wing also in Lahr, 3-wing in Zweibrücken, and 4-wing in Baden-Sellingen. 2 aircraft from each squadron would be on quick reaction alert, or QRA, where the 100 armed aircraft from various NATO air forces had to be in the air and with nuclear weapons in 15 minutes of receiving an alert. And so that process would have required transferring the custody of the nuclear weapons from the Americans to the Canadians. So the weapons themselves were handled by the 7,232nd Munitions Maintenance Group based out of Mülheim in Germany. The weapons themselves are stored in these storage bunkers. These were nicknamed igloos. And so on receiving an alert or on receiving authorization to deploy the weapons, the crews would pull them out of their igloos, attach them to the aircraft. You can correct me on the procedure here. The pilots would receive by radio the arming codes and plug it into the PAL, permissive action link, which is the safety feature on the weapon. If the code matched the code programmed into the weapon, then the weapon armed itself and you could take off and go off on your mission. And you had 4 attack modes. You had, again, he should take over this part of the... There was dive mode. You used your radar to gauge distance and you used your gun sight to line up with the target. This could only be done with retarded weapons because otherwise, again, you would blow yourself up. There was the level identification pass. You go to a pre-selected spot on the map. You would hit the freeze button on your control column that would program that point into your targeting computer. You would then do your zoom climb, and at a particular altitude and speed, the computer would release the bomb into that trajectory, and hopefully it would land somewhere on target. There's also a blind version of this called the blind target identification pass. You would use your radar instead of visual cues to find your reference point. And then TLAR, T-L-A-R. Anybody know what that means? Not you. TLAR. That looks about right, which is just aim it and hope for the best. But of course, we all know that close counts in horseshoes, hand grenades, and thermonuclear weapons. Okay, so moving on, we come to the crudest of the weapons that we've looked at so far, the Douglas MGR-1 Honest John. And when I say crude, I mean crude. This thing has no guidance system of any kind. You have a rocket motor, you have a warhead, you have a fusing system, you have some fins, and that's about it. So this was launched off the back of a ramp on a truck, with the range being adjustable between 5 and 38.5 kilometers just by adjusting the angle of the ramp, just like aiming a regular artillery piece. When the motor fired, a bunch of little solid rocket motors in the nose cone, as well as the canted fins, would impart a 2 RPM stabilizing spin. The motor would burn for 3 seconds, boosting this to Mach 1.5, I believe. And then the rest of the trajectory was purely ballistic. Adding to the crude nature of this, the safety mechanism on this was what was called a Category A PAL, which was a combination bicycle lock. I feel safer already. So this was armed with a W-31 warhead, which had a yield adjustable between 2, 10, and 20 kilotons. This could also be fitted with a 680 kilo conventional high explosive warhead, as well as a cluster munition with little bomblets containing sarin gas to saturate an area with gas. And it didn't deploy any of those. We just had the nuclear warhead, which caused us a little bit of trouble later on, as you'll see. So Canada acquired 155 live rockets and 36 training rockets, as well as 6 sets of support vehicles. So the support vehicles included the actual launcher. We had a crane truck for handling the rockets. We had a transport truck for actually carrying the rockets and their warheads around. And then this is called a tie-down unit. And what they would do is they would put the rocket motor in and they would put a heated blanket, an electric blanket over top of it to warm up the fuel so that it would burn consistently no matter what the temperature was. So it was actually quite a long process to get one of these things fired. Now, 2 units were formed to fire these of the Royal Canadian Artillery, the 1 and 2 SSM, surface-to-surface missile batteries. 1 SSM was the one deployed to Western Europe, to Hammer in Germany, whereas 2 SSM was stationed here in Shiloh, and they were the training unit. So 1 SSM was formed in September 1960. They went to train at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. They were deployed to Hammer in Germany in December 1961, but they did not receive their warheads and become fully nuclear capable until September 1964. So during that entire time, we didn't have conventional warheads. We didn't have anything. We just had dummy. Well, actually, we didn't even have dummy warheads. We'll talk about that a little bit later. We had nothing. So, by the way, anybody here wondering why it's called the Honest John? Anybody ever wondered that? Okay, it's a funny story. So that was coined by the colonel who is in charge of its development at White Sands Missile Range. And the problem was that the development process for this didn't go very well, and it was in danger of being shut down completely by Congress. And so while this colonel was in New Mexico, he came across a local personality who was prone to telling tall tales. And when anybody would call him out on his nonsense, he would say, well, around these parts, they call me Honest John. And the name just kind of stuck. And finally, we get to my favorite Canadian nuclear weapon because it is batshit crazy, the AR-2 Genie. So after we canceled the Avro Aero, of course, we continued to operate the CF-100, but that was a very old, clunky, subsonic aircraft by that time. The United States Air Force realized this left a huge gap in North American aerospace defense. So in 1961, they offered to give us 66 McDonnell F-101 Voodoos on the agreement that A, we would only use them for North American aerospace defense, and number 2, we'd take over control and operating expenses of 10 Pine Tree radar sites. Turned out to be a pretty good deal because we paid off that purchase in only 10 years. So yeah, actually it worked out pretty well. But what to arm them with? Well, in the 1950s, like I said, most interceptors were armed with unguided rockets or cannons and machine guns, which were very ineffective. But guided missile technology was rather in its infancy. So in 1955, Douglas came up with a rather unique interim solution, which was the Genie. This is an unguided nuclear-tipped air-to-air rocket. And just like the Honest John, there's nothing much to it. You have a rocket engine, you have some folding fins, you have a 1.5 kiloton W-25 warhead, an arming and fusing mechanism. That's it. There's nothing more to it. So the aircraft would actually have to align itself with the target using its fire control system and radar, and then launch the rocket towards it and get the hell out of the way. So the acceleration would arm the warhead, and then an onboard timer would set off the warhead after either 12 seconds or 10 kilometers of travel distance. Like I said, it had a yield of 1.5 kilotons, which translated to an effective blast radius of 300 meters, and of course, a much larger radiation radius. Now, if setting off even friendly nuclear weapons over populated areas sounds like kind of a bad idea, you're not alone in believing that. At the time, that was of great concern. So the U.S. Air Force arranged a lovely demonstration. So on July 19, 1957, as the Shot John of Operation Plum Bob, they arranged the demonstration where Northrop F-89 Scorpion launched a live Genie, the first and only time this has ever been done, at an altitude of 15,000 feet over the Nevada test site. And then these 5 guys stood right under the underground zero on the ground below with no protective equipment of any kind. As you can see, they were subjected to a pretty bright flash in the air, but otherwise no unusual radiation, no ill effects. The weapon was proven safe. And that's the actual mushroom cloud that it produced in midair, which is kind of pretty. I have weird taste. So there are 3 Voodoo squadrons that operated the Genie. By the way, we bought 330 of them, as well as various training warheads. We have one of the training versions at the Aviation Museum here, as well as 4 Voodoo simulators. We have one of those here as well. So 409 Squadron in Comox, 425 Squadron in, oh wow, why am I, in Bagotville, sorry. It's getting hot in here. In Bagotville, and then 416 Squadron in Chatham, New Brunswick. And these were also on quick reaction alert, although this was not as extreme as in Western Europe. You had to get your aircraft, 2 aircraft per squadron in the air with their nuclear weapons within 30 minutes. And then they would disperse to remote airfields in the north in order to intercept Soviet bombers coming over the North Pole. So they flew their first, so 409 Squadron flew its first QR on September 25th, 1965, and that was when they became fully active. So I mentioned at the beginning that our flirtation with being a nuclear-armed power lasted barely 20 years. There were a number of reasons for that, mainly political. There was still sustained public opposition to our owning of nuclear weapons throughout the years, and throughout the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, there were numerous mass protests, many of them around just outside of the bases that had these weapons themselves. Some of them were very violently put down by either the RCMP or, in the case of a protest at Comox, by the sailors themselves at the base, and the RCMP didn't interfere with the beatdown. And so there were a number of reasons. This wasn't just driven by normal anti-nuclear pro-peace sentiment, but also, especially later on, by the idea of incineration without representation. This was the idea, I love that phrase. So this was the idea that it was in Canada's best interest to maintain the delicate balance of mutual assured destruction between the United States and the Soviet Union, because if war broke out, we knew that the USSR would likely not discriminate between Canada and the US, and they would attack us both. Or even if they did just attack the United States, stray nuclear weapons would probably fall onto our soil, or fallout from weapons detonating in the US would drift up over the border into our territory. So, and it was believed by many that having nuclear weapons upset that balance and made us more vulnerable, and then we'd be better off getting rid of them. There was also a big political change in defense spending and defense strategy with the election of Trudeau the Elder in 1968. Now, there's also opposition from various MPs, especially the ones of ridings where these weapons were stationed, because they argued that their constituents had no say in those weapons being stationed there in the first place. But there were also a number of operational problems with the weapons themselves. As I mentioned at the very beginning, even though Prime Minister Pearson signed preemptive authorization in 1964, saying that, whatever the circumstances, I authorize the use of the BOMARCs, meaning that authorization to fire them came unilaterally from the US president, there was not actually a system in place for the US to authorize the launch of Canadian BOMARCs for a year, especially not if the president became incapacitated or incommunicado during that period. And it wasn't fully implemented until a year after that. So we had 2 years where we basically had no way for the United States to launch our missiles. Even worse, for a period of an entire year, the Buick base at Saint-Nazaire in Quebec did not have an American officer on staff. This meant that the Canadian officer on duty kept both launch keys in violation of the two-man rule. So for an entire year, a rogue Canadian officer could have launched the BOMARCs without authorization. No word on whether he was obsessed with protecting our precious bodily fluids. But the main reason that we got rid of the BOMARC was because it wasn't a very good weapon to begin with. They did a bunch of test firings over the Gulf of Mexico, and they found that it wasn't nearly as accurate as Boeing had claimed it was. It was also very expensive and difficult to maintain. There are a number of different incidents, including a fire that broke out in the warhead of one of the ones at North Bay. Thankfully, didn't cause too much damage. There was actually one in New Jersey where the whole thing caught fire and it just spread plutonium everywhere. And also, the United States, starting in 1972, was starting to get rid of its BOMARCs in favor of more sophisticated missiles. So we would lose spare parts and logistical support. So in 1972, we decided to shut down the BOMARC stations, and we sent all of the warheads back to the United States. Across the Atlantic, we're having similar problems with the Honest John. So most of the NATO armies that used the Honest John used an organization called the NATO Maintenance Supply and Services Agency, or MSSA, for their maintenance. Canada, being cheapskates, opted out of that organization. But then our missiles started to fall into disrepair and almost became unserviceable. So we had to turn to American batteries to do the maintenance. They were happy to do this at first. Then we kept coming back and coming back and coming back, and they got super annoyed and they started charging us, and they charged us more than what NATO would have charged us. So classic Canada. There was also the problem of we did not think to purchase any practice warheads, and since you can't do drills with a live nuclear warhead, we had to borrow some off of the British. And finally, You're talking about dispersal and the handoff procedure for the warheads. Well, American rules stipulated that you could not disperse the batteries more than a 15-minute walk away from the weapon storage depot. That is well within the blast radius of your average tactical nuclear weapon, which meant that had we actually deployed, we probably would have all been wiped out by a single preemptive counter-battery strike. So yeah, again, not very well planned out. But again, the main reason for getting rid of the Honest John was cost, other armies getting rid of theirs, and the restructuring of the Canadian Armed Forces. So finally, we got rid of ours in 1970. 2 years later, in 1972, our commitment to the NATO nuclear strike mission expired, and we immediately got rid of our nuclear weapons and conventionalized the RCAF. One of the main reasons was that the NATO nuclear strike mission in Western Europe was rather redundant. Like, multiple targets were covered by multiple air forces at the same time, so that if a war had broken out, you would have aircraft attacking the same point at the same time and running into each other's fireballs, and it would have been absolute mayhem. NATO tried to get around this using what were known as SIOP, Single Integrated Operational Plans, which would have required every single aircraft to drop its bomb within a 30-second window to avoid being obliterated. So this was, absurd, and the United States Air Force had enough nuclear weapons already to destroy Eastern Europe many times over, so we decided to pull out of that agreement as soon as we could, and many other air forces did at about the same time. And finally, despite being the most questionable of the nuclear weapons we acquired, the Genie was the longest lived, serving all the way into the 80s. Now, in addition to being of questionable utility, especially as the threat of Russian nuclear bombers coming over the pole continued to decrease over the decades, it was also a huge security risk because the Genie was designed in the era before PAL safety systems, meaning it had none. It didn't even have the combination lock. No safety mechanisms whatsoever. All it had was a pin that you pulled out to switch it from ferry mode to fire mode. And the idea here was that when the Voodoos dispersed those northern airfields, there might not be ground crew on duty, so they would have to land, and the weapons officer would have to get out, pull the pin out to arm the rocket, and then get back in, and they would take off again to make their intercepts. So this made these weapons very, very vulnerable to being stolen and used for nefarious purposes. And this is one of the reasons the Canadian government opted for an official policy of neither confirming nor denying the presence of nuclear weapons on Canadian soil. But eventually we did get rid of them. We fired our last practice Genies in 1980, and then they were finally retired in 1984. With 409 Squadron standing its first QRA on June 28, 1984. This is believed to be the very last day that nuclear weapons were present on Canadian soil. That very same year, Prime Minister Mulroney and President Reagan signed the agreement to allow the U.S. to test cruise missiles over northern Canada. This sparked huge protests across the country. It was a big thing at the time, but the test still went through. So today, we maintain officially in Canada a rather anti-nuclear stance. We are signatories of a whole bunch of different treaties and watchdog organizations, including the 1970 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the 1996 Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and the Stockholm Initiative for Nuclear Disarmament. However, we have not yet ratified the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And the reason for that is because we still depend heavily on the United States nuclear umbrella for our national security. And so signing that treaty would prevent American nuclear-armed aircraft from entering our airspace or landing in our airfields. And that's protection that, maybe this will change soon, but so far, we are not ready to give up just yet. Any questions?